Hey guys, today we're going to look at the first part of Vietnam, and there's only going to be three parts to this, so it's going to go very quickly. So just be sure that you guys get all the notes and keep up. So this is Vietnam Years Part 1, okay? So just a little background on this. After World War II, France attempts to reestablish control of Vietnam. France, during the age of imperialism in the late 1890s, early 1900s, had controlled the area that they called Indochina, right? So it's what we would call Vietnam today. And if you're looking at the map here, the little sliver here in pink, this is Vietnam. It's just just this little country here. So France had controlled it prior to World War II. During World War II, Japan had invaded, the Vietnamese had fought, and essentially, when the war ended, they were expecting their independence. Unfortunately, for both France and Vietnam, as it turns out, when the war ends, France goes back into the country and tries to reestablish it as a colony again. And when they do this, the Vietnamese resist under the leadership of a man named Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh is a nationalist leader. He wants Vietnam to be sovereign and independent. He also leans towards a communist system of government, which of course is going to give him a lot of trouble and cause a lot of trouble in terms of the reaction from the United States. So Eisenhower's government in the early, or I should say, early to mid 50s, Eisenhower's government supports France in its battle against these communist rebels who are trying to kick France out of the country. Okay, the rebels at this time are known as the Viet Minh. Later, that's going to evolve into what's known as the Viet Cong. Okay, but for now, the rebels are called the Viet Minh. Eisenhower and his advisors adhere to what's called the domino theory, and the idea of this is very simple: that if that one little country, Vietnam, falls to the communists and goes communist in terms of its government setup, that the rest of those small countries around it may also go communist as well. The fact that China is so large in the neighborhood here probably also plays a pretty big part in the dis-ease that the Americans feel about the potential of all these countries going communist. Okay, so what I'm getting at is that they're worried about China's influence down here on these nations. So the French suffer a major loss to the rebels, the Ho Chi Minh-led rebels, at a place called Dien Bien Phu. France and the public opinion of the French people really turns against this occupation of Vietnam. They start to feel like it's not worth it. And so they pull out of the country after this loss. Okay, so by 1954, France is going to be gone. And again, you sort of feel like, well, maybe for the Vietnamese people, it's like, oh, we're finally going to have our independence. But of course, it's not going to be quite that easy, right? So how does the U.S. get involved in all this? Well, in order to end the conflict between France and the Vietnamese, the United States offers to step in and help draft a treaty, okay? And that treaty to end the conflict between France and Vietnam and to have France pull out legally is known as the Geneva Accords, okay? Now, as it turns out, when they go in to negotiate the Geneva Accords, Vietnam is essentially divided into two parts. Okay, so this is the reality on the ground. The northern part of the country is controlled by the communists under Ho Chi Minh, who you see here. Meanwhile, the southern part of the country is under the control of anti-communist forces. So they decided this Geneva Accords meeting to divide the country temporarily. Okay, the northern part of the country, north of the 17th parallel, is going to be controlled by the communists and Ho Chi Minh. The southern part of the country, south of the 17th parallel, is going to be controlled by the anti-communist. Their leader is a guy named Diem, who we're going to talk about in just a minute. Okay, so this is going to be seen as a temporary division, and elections are promised to reunify the country as soon as France is done pulling out and everything stabilizes. Okay, so this is where we stand. And it sort of reminds you of the Koreas, I hope, right? Now, whenever France leaves, of course, the United States is concerned that the whole country will follow the lead of the North and go communist. So the United States begins to provide support to those anti-communist forces in the South. and that's economic support, it's military advisors, it's weapons, it's all these things to prop up the Southern government in their coming conflict against the communists in the North. The president of the South is a guy named Diem. Okay, and you can see him here on the picture, shaking hands with Eisenhower. Diem Diem cancels these elections that were promised in the Geneva Accords. You would think that a leader who's backed by the United States would be in favor of democracy, but the truth is, right, Diem is afraid that Ho Chi Minh will win if they hold an election. Okay, so they're afraid that the communists may actually win control of the government through legal elections. So as a reaction to this, Diem cancels those elections. Diem is already not super popular, but by canceling these elections, he sort of puts another nail in his own coffin, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Now, when Diem cancels these elections, we see an upsurge of attacks on his government in the South by a group of communist rebels known as Viet Cong. Okay, so essentially these are the Viet Minh who had fought the French. Now they're going to come into the South and fight against Diem and his government in the South. So they start these attacks. They're guerrilla attacks, and what I mean by that is, the Viet Cong fighters don't come out in uniforms and say, "Hey, we're here to fight." They blend in, they commit assassinations and other sort of terrorist activities in the South. The idea is to overthrow Diem's government. Now, in the meantime, the United States is getting more and more heavily involved in this because they see that things are maybe not going to go Diem's way, and that a lot of the country is in support of Ho Chi Minh and the communists. Okay, so the United States starts to get involved. The Viet Cong in the South are being supplied by the North through a trail through the mountains known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and you can see that here. And it actually goes through the mountains of a country called Laos, which is the country right next door to Vietnam. Okay, so they're being supplied with guns, everything along this trail, and the North is keeping them going. In the meantime, Diem is actually assassinated. Right, Diem is very unpopular in the South, even among his own people, for a lot of reasons. The Northerners obviously hate him, but a lot of the Southerners don't like him either. For one thing, there's a religious issue. He's a Catholic in a country that's dominated by Buddhists, and he favors Catholics for government positions and things like that. A lot of people see it as discriminatory. Another big issue is that his government is very corrupt. Okay, so ultimately, Diem and his brother are assassinated, and that's with U.S. approval. Right? Kennedy sort of gave a nod and a wink on that one, but they're assassinated. And they're hoping that they can get a better leader in place who can solidify control of the country for the South. By 1963, we started to bomb the North, and JFK has sent in about 16,000 military advisors to help the South Vietnamese army in their conflict against the Viet Cong and against Ho Chi Minh. Now, they're not openly fighting the North quite yet, but there's a civil war brewing in Vietnam, and we're going to find ourselves, right in the middle of it. Okay. Now, after Diem's death, right, after he's assassinated, of course, JFK is assassinated not long after, right? Diem was killed in August, and JFK is actually killed in November of that same year. In August of 1964, with Lyndon Johnson as president, there's an incident that is seen by many as the main cause of the Vietnam War for the United States, and that is the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Okay, in this incident, a U.S. ship, it's called the Maddox, is attacked by 3 Vietnamese torpedo boats. There's an exchange of gunfire. The American ship, I think, gets 1 bullet hole where maybe 4 or 5 North Vietnamese soldiers are killed. The question is where the ships were. If you guys can see up here on the map real quick, this is the Gulf of Tonkin, and this is where the incident occurs. So the North Vietnamese basically say, hey, we're just defending our territorial waters, whereas the United States say, hey, we're just in open waters on like a fact-finding mission. So there's a big split there. Also, there is a second Gulf of Tonkin incident, which is reported by the Navy. Okay, so 2 days after the initial incident, the Navy reports to LBJ and the Department of Defense that another incident has taken place where Vietnamese ships have confronted an American ship After this is kind of like the last straw, and LBJ goes to Congress to ask for action and ask for more troops to help out the